Welcome to the Demography Today lecture series, sponsored by the BBVA Foundation, by the Spanish National Research Council and the LOMPOP Horizon 2020 project. And we have the pleasure today to have Stanislao Mazzoni here to talk about Sardinian fertility and the transition of fertility in Italy. Stanislao is a master's degree in biology at Parma University and PhD in anthropological science at Bologna University. In 2015, he obtained the National Scientific Qualification for the post of Associate Professor in Demography and Social Statistics. He is right now a Marie Sklodowska-Curie Fellow at the Spanish National Research Council at our department. And his project aims to increase understanding of fertility in Southern Europe. Dr. Mazzoni has collaborated with national and international research groups, and he is co-author of papers on the importance of socioeconomic status in the fertility decline in Europe and America. His current research interests include historical demography and demography, with a focus on fertility studies, and he has been the secretary of the Italian Society of Historical Demography, CIDES, from 2012-2018. So welcome, Stanislao, to our lecture series. As usual, we have between 45 minutes to 1 hour presentation, and then we open the floor for questions.
Today, I'll talk a little bit on this topic that is, the title is The Unusual Path of Sardinia Fertility Transition. I summarize here the main points of my presentation. I will start with the description of the unusual path of Sardinia fertility transition, and more in general, the path, the multitude of transition in Italy. I will provide some evidence coming from microdata of the town of Alghero in Sardinia and other Sardinian community. And I will describe the first stages of fertility decline in the highland, focusing my attention especially on the role of SES and education. So we start with the historical perspective by reassuming the main findings of Princeton project that work on the decline of fertility. The main findings of the project show that fertility decline in Italy, as in other European countries, followed its own specific path. But another important point was the knowledge of the possibility of a multitude of transition paths, each one determined by their specific historical and geographical context. So the possibility not of only one unique transition, but a multitude of transition in the at the national level. More's study, however, confirmed that the path and the pace of transition of Italy differed quite dramatically from one region to another region, and many times inside the same region. There were a lot of differences and heterogeneity. Here we see the regional division of Italy today. At the time of national unification that occurred in 1861, the subdivision were very, very similar. And thanks to this map, we can summarize the path of fertility control in Italy. Basically, the project showed one great direction. The reduction of fertility started in the northern part of Italy, and later in time in the southern part of Italy. So forms of fertility control started in the most advanced and most economically developed part of Italy first. Another direction was detected from west to east. In fact, Liguria was one of the region, the region forerunner of fertility control in Italy, and Veneto was one of the latest latecomer in fertility control. But the big difference at the national level was between north part and south part of the region. Of course, of the country. The main reason of this phenomenon was the more industrialized north, more developed communication system, rail system, and economy, of course, industrialization at the north, a rural economy in the south. Sardinia, as an island, experimented an unusual and completely different path in fertility transition. It can be summarized here in three main points. So at the aggregate level, the process of fertility transition in Sardinia stand out from the national trend. First point, at the initial low level compared to other southern region, even compared with the region of south. Fertility level in Sardinia went on to become the highest during the 50s in Italy. For example, while the national average was around 2.3 and the south was 3.2, the TFR of Sardinia was approaching 4 children per woman. It was the latest latest region in Italy in fertility reduction. This process was completed in the middle hand of the 70s. In contrast, nowadays, Sardinia presents the low fertility level of all Italian regions. So a very peculiar and strange path in fertility decline. So using the words of Bottazzi, that wrote a book on economic development of Sardinia, Sardinia has become post-industrial without ever being fully industrial. There was a big jump from an agriculture phase to a post-industrial phase. It's something like the Sardinia jumped completely an intermediate phase. Here I show some picture published in an article of an Italian paper, L'Espresso, in 1959 that show the poor living condition of people, of Sardinian people living in rural area, but not only rural area. So poor condition, people living with animal in the house. The title of this article was called L'Africa in casa, that means Africa in the house. And this article highlighted the poor development state of Sardinia at that time. This article has recently been republished by the national newspaper La Repubblica, including other pictures that documented the poor living condition of Sardinia people, and more in general the south of Italy in the middle of the 20th century. Here I describe some differences in terms of level of fertility between Sardinia and the rest of Italy. Here I use the data published in the book of Massimo Livibacci, and more precisely I use the Marital Fertility Index EIG of Cole. And we can see, if we assume that 0.6 is a threshold for any form of fertility control, and 0.4 a threshold for some form of control, we can see that control inside the marriage in Sardinia shows a continuous trend without falling the threshold of fertility control. On the other hand, we can see the path of Italy, even if it's merged between the big differences between North and South. The starting of fertility control inside the marriage started sooner in the country in comparison with the island. This comparison is most dramatic if we compare the level of Sardinia, the marital fertility of Sardinia, at the level of the two regions that are considered the forerunner of fertility control in Italy, especially the level of Tuscany. Of course, there are some papers that are demonstrating that fertility control started before the national unification of 1861 in some reality in Italy. But at general level, at the regional level, there is a big differences between the forerunner and latecomer of fertility control in Italy. But why Sardinia was so different? Of course, we have talked about isolation, less an agriculture economy that was permanent for a long period of time, but Sardinia was considered for a long period of time in the pre-transitional period a real demographic oddity at the national context. These characteristics can be summarized with a late marriage for man and woman, a neo-local model of family formation, and a weird form of living arrangement pattern that obliges spouses to arrive at the wedding with the means necessary for creating a self-sufficient household. And this living arrangement pattern was present in the rural area, but also present in the city and the small city of Sardinia. Nuclear family was the prevailing pattern in rural area, but also in the cities. For example, in the census of 1921 in Alghero, that is a small city of the north, more than 70% of the family was a nuclear family. So at the end, the island appeared to be the least Mediterranean Italian region, even if paradoxically is in the center of the Mediterranean Sea. The Mediterranean model par excellence, in fact, is characterized by joint patrilocal household with early female marriage, age, and high fertility. Is far distant from the model that prevailed in Sardinia in the pre-transitional period. Here I introduced the microanalytical approach to study of fertility in Alghero and in Sardinia in general, because despite the importance of result of Princeton project, until a few years ago, there were a small number of papers that with microdata addressed the issue of transition of fertility in Italy. Most of them concentrated in the north of the country, but not in the south. We can think about the pioneeristic work of David Kerzer in Casalecchio di Reno. We can think about the villages studied with the Eurasian project. Some papers described the southern Italy context, but there was a big lag in the presence of study and papers. Alghero in Sardinia has been the first study carried out with individual data about an urban population in the south of the country and belonging to a region marked by a particular fertility decline transition. In subsequent years, thanks to the use of a valuable source such as the 1961 census, other communities were studied. Other communities were studied also in Sardinia, thanks to the works of Michel Poulain, that studied villages in the southern part of the region. So here, so the necessity, is possible basically to study fertility transition in Italy only with microdata of cities, of villages, because detailed data on fertility are available in Italy only for the late years of the 20th century, thanks to the National Institute of Statistics. To study the fertility transition and the first demographic transition, we need microdata. Here I present two types of data: the Alghero database that cover the period 1866-1935, and the Italian census of 1961 for Alghero and other Sardinian communities. Before introducing the data, I briefly introduce the community of Alghero, that is situated in the northwest of the island. Now is a well-known touristic city, but in the past, during the studied period, Alghero was the third largest city in the island, just behind Cagliari in the south and Sassari in the north. The population of Alghero increased gradually during this period, with an average annual growth rate of about 8%, a little bit more than the regional level. Socioeconomic characteristic of Alghero during this period remain stationary. The primary sector was agriculture, zootechny, forestry, hunting, and fishing, and employed, in fact, about 60% of the active population. A peculiarity is that more than half the population in Alghero was involved in agriculture. That is a little bit strange for a coastal town, but this is a typical trait of Sardinian coastal town and some Sardinian, some southern Italy cities. In this period, infant and child mortality rate in Alghero decreased very slowly until the end of the century, and more rapidly in the following years. During this period, the community enjoyed both economical and social stability, and only a small number of persons, more or less 6% of the population, enjoyed much better living conditions than the rest of the population. In fact, the typical inhabitant of Alghero suffered from many diseases, illness like trachoma, that is a disease of eye, tuberculosis, and malaria, of course, that was endemic of the entire island. The effect of the diseases were amplified by nutrition and by poor domestic hygiene. In fact, the literacy level of the population was very low. Over 3/4 of the population were almost entirely illiterate. Was the same in the rest of the the island. Conversely, the upper class, this small group of only 6% of the population, could expect better health, tended to be taller and more generally had lower mortality both in their early years and childhood. This phenomenon is reflected, for example, in the medium height per SES. Here we see a table of mean height by father SES in Alghero. We can see a huge differences between the small elite group, for example, compared with farmer, that was the poorest group in the city. It's a reflection of better living condition, better nutrition, and better living condition. I introduced the data that I use today to show some result on fertility reduction. The first sources is the Alghero database, that is the union of civil and religious sources. For example, we have civil records of birth, marriage, and death for the entire period. We have the same type of record, but from the church, so baptism, marriage, and burial records. We have also military record in order to have some anthropometric measure for the male part of the population. We have censuses like 1921 and 1961, and we use also municipal electoral rolls for the year 2011 in order to control the movement on the territory of the migration. This migration and movement of the population can be also controlled with civil record of birth that report information on birth, on mother age, but it also report the events of the future events of the ego, for example, the date of death and the date of marriage. So it's possible to control for other demographic events, also for migration. Here an example of family reconstitution with the Henry method is one of the more than 6,000 families, biological families. We have detailed information on birth event. Here we can see a very large family, but it was very common in Sardinia in that period. We have detailed information on dates, so we can construct event history analysis model in order to control the birth intervals. We can use occupation at marriage, but also occupation of the father in the moment of the birth. So we can construct SES indicator for all the population. The information on occupation is reported for male, and for female is never reported, or when is reported is not useless. Housewife was the common occupation. Here I highlighted the dates of marriage. This is not just a curiosity. It's a very important point in the study of fertility in the pre-transitional period. Here we have two dates of marriage for this couple, the civil date and the religious date. Because before the 1866, the registration of demographic events in Italy was recorded by the church, and only after by the civil, by the town hall. So for each couple, we have 2 dates. Sometimes the dates are exactly the same. Sometimes there are a lag. Sometimes people married before in church and after in the town hall. Sometimes the opposite. So it is very important to have 2 dates in order to determine the starting point of the marital union. Here, for example, we can see the series of religious marriages and civil marriages in Arghero. They tell more or less the same story, but not exactly the same stories. There is some differences. So it's important to take into account the 2 dates of marriage. Here, a curiosity, before the introduction of the new law on civil marriage, there is a huge number of religious registration. Probably these people wanted to avoid the effect of the new law, of the new rules. So they anticipated the marriage before the introduction of the new law. Having 2 dates of marriage is important also in order to take into account the legitimacy, because the major part of illegitimacy in Alghero, but is the same in Italy, was due to a religious marriage that occurred many times before the civil marriage. So in order to take into account, to have precise measure of marital fertility, we use 2 dates. I close this parenthesis on the data on Alghero, and I move to another source that is the 10th General Census of the Population, dated 15 October 1961. It was a national census. It was widespread over the population, of course. It recorded all the Italian population. It recorded detailed information on woman and marriage. For example, woman's birth, marriage court, woman's age at marriage, woman's birthplace, and most important, woman's education, with a high level of detail on this information. But not only information on the woman and man, of course, but also information on household living condition. For example, the house possessory title, the house location, the presence of services in the house, for example, the number of rooms, the presence of services like bathroom, heating system, and so on. And with this information, it's possible to construct a SES indicator for the inhabitants. But the most interesting part of this census is the section 7 of the census of 1961. So the second fertility survey in Italy is the second because the first was included in the census of 1931, and this one, the second, was more detailed in comparison with the first one. Thanks to those data included in the fertility survey, it's possible to investigate the reproductive behavior of Italian women for a very long period of time. Here we can see a detail on information on the woman. For example, this is the woman number 2 in the household that is in another sheet of the document. Here birth of parents are reported. Is reported the starting date of the marriage, in this case 1934, and this included the total number of birth events of this woman with distinction of gender, 5 males and 4 females, and most important things, the birth year of every children. So with this census, it's possible to reconstruct the complete reproductive history in terms of intensity and frequency of women, married list 1, born before 1911. The incomplete history for those born afterwards. Here we can see aggregate data provided by ISTAT only 10 years, more or less, after the more than 10 years after the census. Aggregate results at regional level. Here we can see the mean number of children per ever married woman. This one is the level of Italy. This is the level of the region with the maximum fertility, Veneto, Basilicata, and Sardinia. And here with the white dots, the level of region with the lowest fertility. This, as we know, was Liguria. So it's an important source because it can cover a very large period of time. Okay, I start with the presentation of some result about marital fertility with microdata. I start with Alghero for the period 1866-1935, the period covered by the Alghero database. Here we can see a synthetic description of fertility during this period. TMFR was relatively high, 7.4, of course, is the level for the entire period. The Cole and Russell indexes shows not a present of form of control, especially small m is lower than the threshold limit that is 0.2, so there is no control of fertility in this period. Mean birth intervals is relatively short. Age at first marriage was 22.3 for bride, more or less 27 for groom, with a huge difference between the spouses. Here, even age at the last child is not reported here, was very high for the entire period. So legitimate fertility was not particularly affected also by the duration of the marriage. The woman's ability to have child in this period in Alghero, Sardinia, is strongly related to her age. Here we plot the age-specific rate for a different age at marriage, divided in 5 age groups. And we can see that every curve more or less tells the same story here. So there was no an effect of the duration of the marriage in marital fertility. In fact, the largest part of population of Alghero did not control fertility and tried to maximize reproductive capacity to the limit of the biological threshold of woman and of man, of course. Even if we divide in period this type of analysis, legitimate fertility in Alghero did not decline much in the years between 1866 and 1935. If we consider P1, the first period, 1866-1915, total marital fertility rate was 7.6 and 6.9 in the period 1916-1935. We have to say that this moderate slope probably is due also by the First World War. That was a strong, it has a strong effect, especially on economy of Sardinia and Alghero too. So we see that fertility didn't decrease in the entire period. We wanted to see the role of SES to detect any differences in socioeconomic status in terms of fertility behaviors in Alghero. This is possible, as we have seen, using the information on occupation of the male at the moment of the marriage. Of course, to control this effect, we propose in the past some paper analyzing this topic, running event history analysis model, especially with Cox regression, and controlling the result from with many other variables. The idea was that the most elevated SES present in the town, the small group of elite played like a forerunner of fertility control in the town of Alghero. In fact, I show here the result from a comparative paper on where Alghero was compared with other villages and other community in Europe and in America. Here we divided in two periods. For Alghero, the first period was the pre-transitional period, 1866-1950, and the second period was 1960-1935. Of course, this division is valid, period division is valid only for Alghero, not for other communities. And we see that running a Cox regression, that in the first period, the pre-transitional period, there is no big differences between higher groups, the elite, and the other group in terms of fertility of higher birth. But in the second period, we can see a decrease in the likelihood of having another child. Big differences in comparison with the references category that was the unskilled group. So it may be interpreted as a first phase, a first stage of fertility control in the island and in Alghero in particular, a role played by the high status part of the population. But unfortunately, the Alghero dataset does not permit to study the role of the education on one hand, and on the other hand, does not permit to study a long period of time. So the role of education was investigated with another set of papers regarding Alghero, but also other Sardinian community. This graph shows the differences. Here I use the 1961 census, and I show the level of fertility of Alghero in terms of mean number of children per every married woman. The trends of Alghero followed more or less the trend of the island, with an high value here that probably is due to the small numbers for the older woman. And we compare the Sardinia region and Alghero with the national level. So we wanted to see in this trend, especially the left part of this graph, the completed fertility women, the role of education. So in order to study this topic, we ran multivariate model based on Poisson regression of the number of children, and we control for education using the information included in the census, but we also control for SES with information on the house, with an index constructed with information on the house, house possession and other characteristic of the house. And we found, we didn't find an effect, an effect on birth curves, no differences between the curves, so there is no reduction along the birth curves for completed fertility woman of Alghero, but we found an effect for the secondary educated woman. So secondary educated women in comparison with women without education experimented a lower number of children. It's possible to see also a sort of gradient, even if it's not statistically significant with primary education. So for completed fertility women in Alghero, education, even controlled for SES, was an important factor in fertility reduction. But unfortunately, this study published on Popolazione Storia, the Italian journal, deal only with completed fertility women and not with the most interesting part of the story, that is the second one, the incompleted history. So to complete the history, another paper was published by Breschi and collaborators. They included other community in Sardinia, because Alghero, of course, is Sardinia, but maybe it is not representative of all the highlands. So they include another coastal village, city, Porto Torres. They include a central city as Macomer and two other villages from the southern part of the highland. They also included a village from Campania near Naples, that is Massa Lubrense. They included a sharecropper reality like Casalguidi. They included Novellara, that is a northern village near the Po River, and two villages from the region of Friuli, in the extreme north of the country. So one of the goals of this paper was to detect if Sardinia was an unique immobile demographic system, or rather a variegated population with different microdemographic system. So to summarize the most interesting results, I here reported the result about the interaction models. Here, they study completed and incomplete fertility history using the first 10 years of marriage, and the birth event occurred in the first 10 years of marriage. What emerged from these results? Of course, emergent, for example, in the first result, interaction between marriage court and geographic localization, that everywhere fertility decreased, of course, but the decrease was stronger for northern region here in black and gray than for Sardinia or southern region. Another interesting result was the interaction between geographical localization and education level. Here we can see the geographic localization, north, center, the south, inner Sardinia, and southern Sardinia. We can see the effect of education. For north and center, but also for the community of the south, it's possible to see a gradient with a reduction of fertility for most educated women. The gradient is going from no educated to secondary educated women. This gradient does not appear in Sardinia, and the difference is only between secondary educated women and no educated or primary educated women. Okay, despite this point goes beyond the purpose of this presentation, it's necessary to describe the connection between the first and second demographic transition. So what happened when the first demographic transition ended in Sardinia in the year 70 of the 20th century? Of course, there were an increasing of education thanks to a subsequent law on compulsory education, especially for women, that reduce illiteracy, that increase educational level of the island. The economy of the island changes completely its face after the end of the fertility, the demographic transition, and in the following years, agriculture and farming and fishing economy almost faded away and disappeared. Nowadays, the total GDP is represented only by 3% of agriculture and farming and fishing in Sardinia. The effect of this rapid change was a huge fall of fertility in the island, a fall that was more rapid than in the rest of the country. According, in fact, with Perez and Livi-Bacci, that published many years ago a paper on Italy and Spain, between 1975 and 1919, TFRs decreasing of 37%, passing from 2.64 in 75 to 1.4 in 19. So the stronger degrees in Italy compared with the rest of the country. So nowadays, Sardinia is a complete different region. Agriculture is no more important, only 3% of the economy. Economy is dominated by commerce, financial activity, real estate, other economic activity related to services, construction. And in the recent past, there were some signals of modernization. For example, of premature modernization in comparison with the rest of the country. For example, Sardinia was the first region in Italy for the arrival of the new digital television. In Sardinia started the first private internet, or one of the first internet provider in Italy that bring it with him many companies related with new technology, new technology and telecommunication. So a completely changed reality in a very short period of time. So, in conclusion, today, Sardinia is no more a demographic oddity, but is a typical Southern Europe region. In fact, Sardinia has experienced over the last 15 years very low fertility rate, around 1.1, and in 2017, Sardinia is the region with the lowest TFR in Italy, 1.06. Mean age child is 32.5, the second highest value in Italy, only after the Basilicata, and childness is rapidly increasing in the highland as in the rest of the country, of course. So this, for conclude this speech with this very rapid and brief summary of the present fertility situation in the island. I want to conclude with some literature that I cited, maybe not all this literature, and I want to thank for your attention.